love the gospel of the Lord.
Heart to Heart, a Catholic media ministry, presents an inspiring gospel reflection by Father Michael Sparrow. Father Michael is a Jesuit priest working as a writer and retreat master at the Bellarmine Jesuit Retreat House outside Chicago.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. The Lord said, "Woe to you, Pharisees! You pay tithes of mint and of rue and of every garden herb, but you pay no attention to judgment and to the love for God. These you should have done without overlooking the others. Woe to you, Pharisees! You love the seats of honor in synagogues and greetings in marketplaces. Woe to you! You are like unseen graves over which people unknowingly walk." Then one of the scholars of the law said to Jesus in reply, "Teacher, by saying this, you are insulting us too." And he said, "Woe to you, scholars of the law! You impose burdens on people hard to carry, but you yourselves do not lift one finger to touch them." The Gospel of the Lord. Woe to you! What does love look like? Is it always gentle and kind? We love those passages where Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are burdened, and I will refresh you." Let me suggest that Jesus is just as loving in today's gospel when he says, "Woe to you," as he is when he says, "Come to me, all you who are burdened." There are different colors of love, different facets of love. What Jesus is engaging in today is tough love in the face of the obstinacy in the heart of the scribes and the Pharisees and the lawyers. And what's Jesus' argument toward them? Is that they're focusing on the minor aspects of the law while neglecting the weightier aspects of the law. They're focusing on some of the tithes for the garden herbs. You know that in Jewish laws, there were hundreds of these laws, and it was the task, self-appointed task of the Pharisees to be the interpreters of the law. Because with all of these laws, the average person would get confused, and so the scholars of the law and the Pharisees studied them and doled out their wisdom to the people. It's notable that the Pharisees were not priests, they were lay people who were exceedingly devout. And Jesus' argument with them is that, yes, okay, this is good, you're interpreting all of the laws. I'm not saying neglect these, but by focusing on the minutiae, you're neglecting the care for the poor, the love of God, and justice. And then, as we just heard in the gospel, one of the lawyers comes up and says, "Rabbi, when you're insulting them, you're insulting us, and we're the good guys." And then Jesus turns his anger at the lawyers and says, "You're piling up heavy burdens on the people by the fine points of the law, and you're not helping them." Now, what's the difference between Jesus' anger and the anger on the part of the scribes and the Pharisees and the lawyers? Jesus' anger at them is made to bring them to conversion, to open their hearts to the fullness of the gospel. Whereas the anger on the part of the scribes, the Pharisees, and the lawyers is all about puffing up their own egos, protecting their own share of the pie. Jesus' anger would issue forth on the cross of Jesus laying down his life and saying, Father, forgive them, they're ignorant, they don't know what they're doing. There's no self-righteousness in the heart of Jesus. It's an anger born of love. Can't you see what you're doing? It's one of those veritable, thanks, I needed that. Let's wake up, folks. I don't want you to go to hell. I don't want your heart to be closed. I want you to be saved, which is why I'm exercising tough love. Now that's in contrast to the scribes and Pharisees that say, you're insulting us. How dare you insult us? We're the teachers. We're the know-it-alls. We want you dead. It's all about protecting their position. Jesus is calling them to conversion. They're about protecting their own positions in society. Big difference. Different kinds of anger. Because what's underneath Jesus' anger is deep love. What's underneath the scribes and the Pharisees' anger is just pride and egotism. Let me give you a couple of examples of, I think, where this may apply in our society today. Some of you remember this story. It's kind of the go-to story for me in this regard. There was a woman, very pious woman, that I knew several years ago. And she was very upset that the priest in her parish was not washing his hands at the offertory rite. You'll notice at every Mass, I wash my hands. It's one of the rules of the church. Priests are supposed to wash their hands. Now, I don't know why this priest didn't wash his hands, but he didn't. And this was a source of great upset for this pious woman. She was a daily communicant. She prayed the rosary every day. She lit candles. She was externally very devout. But this really got to her. It was a bee in a bonnet. And she went to the pastor and she complained. And nothing happened. And so she wrote to the bishop about this. And nothing happened. And then she went to me and she was complaining. And I tried to say, okay, I don't know why he isn't doing this, but it's not the most important thing. Well, it was her thing. Sometime later, not very long later, she fell in love with a man who was divorced, didn't get an annulment. She ran off with him, and they had a civil marriage because they couldn't get married in the church. As a result of her marriage being illegal, she left the church. I think that speaks to focusing on the minutiae and missing the much larger issue here. She was willing to leave the church, but she was upset about this minor rule. Jesus is talking about proportionality here. He's not saying this isn't important, but he says it's much less important than these bigger issues over here. Let me give you another example. Pope Francis is our Pope. And for many Catholics, he's a controversial figure. Two things that have really upset people about Pope Francis. One is in his document on marriage, Amoris Laetitia, in one of the footnotes, and it's a footnote, and by way of saying it's a footnote is this is not the major thing, he suggests that there should be a pathway for those Catholics who are divorced and remarried, whose marriages have not been recognized by the church. If they're in a stable relationship, there should be a pathway toward having that marriage recognized by going to their pastor and invoking what's called a long-standing tradition in the church, the internal forum. Many have criticized Pope Francis for that, of saying, you're changing the laws of the church. Divorced and remarried, you have to get an annulment. If you don't get an annulment, you're excommunicated from the church, period. And we got the scriptures of Jesus saying, if you're divorced and remarried and it haven't been annulled, you're committing adultery. Pope Francis, how can you change that? I would say in response to that, Pope Francis is not trying to throw out the laws of the church, but in the example of Jesus in the gospel, he is trying to alleviate some of the heavy burdens that life brings with it. Everyone knows that Pope Francis loves the poor. He spent his lifetime in service to the poor. And when you work in the midst of the poor community and you see the burdens that these people face, you look at the laws and you say, how can we make this work in this set of circumstances? And I would challenge any lawyer in the church, if your kid gets into trouble, you'll bend over backwards to make sure you get the right judge, and you get the right kind of hearing, and you study the law, and you find some little situation in the law of, okay, in 1849, this situation applies here, and that's why this member of my family should be exonerated. Don't we do that? Don't we all do that? When it's our own and we care about them and we love them, we'll look and we'll say, I know this is the ideal circumstance, but let's be real here. Let's cut a deal here. Or your kid gets arrested for drunken driving. Who among you would not go out and find the best lawyer that you can find so that you get a favorable judgment for your kid because you know your kid's a good kid and they made a mistake, they did something stupid. Kids do stupid stuff. Don't we do that? We all do that for those we love. I think that's what Jesus is talking about here today. When he goes after the lawyers and he says, you impose burdens on them and you don't lift one finger to touch them, except if it's your own. If it's your own situation or someone you love, then you'll move heaven and earth to make the system operate in a way that's helpful. I think that's what Pope Francis is trying to do. He's saying, folks, they're in stable relationships. It's not the ideal. But this is a system that has been in place for decades in the church. Pope Francis is saying, let's be honest about that. That's in fact how we've made it work. Let me give you another example. That's a hot topic. Right now, there's a synod on the Amazon that's going on. The Amazon is in South America. It comprises the rainforest. Several different countries are within the Amazon region. And over in Rome right now going on is the synod, and they're dealing with many important issues. But one of those issues, and it's the one that's received the most press, is the possibility of ordaining married men who are members of the Amazon community, the so-called viri probati, pillars of the community. In many cases, they've been serving their communities as catechists. They're very involved in the church as a way of addressing a critical priest shortage. We sometimes talk about the priest shortage in the United States. In the United States, there's one priest for every 1,300 people. In the Amazon region, there's one priest for every 16,000 people. Priest shortage in the United States, 1 out of every 1,300 people. In the Amazon, 1 out of every 16,000 people. What that means is they see a priest, if they're lucky, once every 6 months. They choose between, are you going to have your priest come to the community on Christmas, or are you going to have the priest come on Easter? You don't get both. Can't even be a Christer coming on Christmas and Easter because the priest is only going to show up once. And so Pope Francis has said, let's look at this. Let's have the bishops look at this. Is priestly celibacy a good thing? Yes. Is it the greatest good? Should we be depriving people of the sacraments because of a priest shortage? When for the first 1,000 years of the church, we had married clergy. St. Peter was married. Most of the apostles were married. Pope Francis has raised this up as a question. Let's look at it. Let me just end with a story by Max Lucado, Christian author, one of my favorite storytellers. This is from his book, Tell Me the Secrets. Once upon a time, there was a land that experienced a critical water shortage. There was a severe drought that affected the land. And so water became the most precious commodity in that community. Whenever it rained, the people would put out their buckets to be able to get the water. They exercised very careful conservation. They did everything they could do to preserve the water. And one day, a farmer, while he was driving fence posts into the ground, noticed that the water was soggy. And when he began to dig, he discovered an underwater cavern that was filled with water. He took a cup, he dipped it into the water and drank it cool, clear, clean. He filled up buckets and brought his wagon to the town, and the people rejoiced when he said, "I have found water." And then he took a bucket of water, and in an exuberance, he threw it over a young boy and just splashed, and the whole town erupted in cheers. And there was plenty of water for people to wash with, to bathe with, to cook with, to plant. And the farmer promised, every day I will go out to this cavern and I will bring back the buckets of water, and you can have as much water as you want. And he did this for many days, but then the farmer had a dream. And in the dream, he saw that some people were not thankful for the water. They were just taking it for granted. They were feeling that they were entitled to the water. So the next day, the farmer came into the town and he said, only those people who are grateful for the water will receive it. Well, all of the town people came in and each one of them said, thank you, thank you, thank you. And no one who did not say thank you would receive the water. And this continued for many days, but then one day the farmer had another dream. And in that dream, he saw that some of the people who were receiving the water were not kind to each other. They were lying, they were cheating, they were stabbing each other in the back. And he decided right then and there, only the worthy will receive the water. And he asked the town people to say, if there is anyone who is unworthy, who is not living according to the commandments of God, you write their names down and give them to me. And only the worthy will receive the water. And he went down and he looked at the scrolls, and lo and behold, the name of every person in the town was there except his own. So sadly, he said, no more water for the town, and kept it to himself. Amen? Amen.
Heart to heart, hand in hand, praying for grace to understand.